Our guest this evening is known to many of you. He's a professor of applied economics at the Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Hanke, his wife mentioned quickly as we were chatting that he's always in and out. And when you read his resume, that's the only thing I could think of was a man in a hurry. I'm somewhat awed by what he accomplishes in a relatively limited period of time. Let me just remind you of a few of the things. He's chairman of the Friedberg Mercantile Group in New York, engaging in currency and securities trading. He's president of the Toronto Trust Argentina in Buenos Aires, and that, by the way, was in 1995 the outstanding trust in emerging countries, for emerging areas. He's president of FCMI NZ Financial Corporation, operating out of New Zealand. He's advised a number of governments, either the head of state directly or an agency in Yugoslavia, Lithuania, Argentina, Bulgaria, and presently, of course, Indonesia, most relevantly. He's a member of the steering committee of the G7 Council in Washington and a fellow at the World Economic Forum in Geneva. Not only has he advised a number of foreign countries, he was a senior economist in 1980 to 1981 with the Reagan administration's Council of Economic Advisors. Additionally, in the last decade, he's authored 9 books, mostly dealing, of course, with development, capital markets, currency and finance, stabilization, and decentralization. But we're especially interested this evening in this extraordinary experience which he's had with Indonesia. He's been advising the Indonesian government on the question of their approach to their economic difficulties. You've all followed that with a great deal of interest, I'm sure. The questions of the role of the International Monetary Fund in the global economic system are, of course, intrinsic, and it's a wonderful case study. And Professor Hanke has been very much in the middle of that rather unique circumstance. Everyone has particular links to Indonesia, I suppose, or interests in it. Of course, the president of Indonesia is part of that group of military people who were such good friends of the United States during the Cold War. I can remember years ago chatting with our Army attaché station in Jakarta and how proud they were of the degree of support of the United States by that Indonesian Army group. But that's ancient history. Today the question is economic matters. The topic this evening is fascinating: IMF policy fiascos in Indonesia. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Steve Hanke.
Thank you very much, Frank, and ladies and gentlemen. I'll try to be as brief as I can and hit some of the high points with regard to Indonesia. and then we can get right into questions and answers. I think one theme that will run through my remarks, I hope in any case, or maybe the questions and answers, will be the mismatch between what was really going on in Indonesia and what actually is still going on in Indonesia, and press accounts. Yeah. There we go. How's that? Better? Okay. There really is a tremendous mismatch, and for people interested in foreign affairs, where you get most of your information from the ordinary, everyday press, let me suggest that you've been probably misled on the whole Indonesian story, because what is in the press has almost nothing to do with reality. It's a pretty sad story, in fact, and rather shocking. Let's first of all, a little background on Indonesia. Frank had a little allusion to President Suharto and the good graces he was held in the past. But if you look at the thing just from strictly an economic point of view, even the last 10 years have registered kind of fantastic growth in Indonesia, and this is not an exception to what's been going on for about 30 years in Indonesia. The GDP has been growing on average about 6% per year, and inflation has been about 8.8% over the last decade, which for an emerging market country is pretty good. In fact, for anybody, it's pretty good. Even in 1997, as the economy started to collapse, GDP still registered a 4.7% growth rate. Inflation was only 6.6%, and one little item that's important is non-performing loans held by individuals and businesses in Indonesia were only 5% of all the loans outstanding. Now let's look at the prospect for 1998. We've got GDP growth, I think, will be at least minus 15%, although the IMF tells us it will only be minus 4%. Inflation, probably 55 to 75% in 1998. Again, the IMF, I think, is erring on the side of optimism. They're projecting a 20% inflation rate. As far as those non-performing loans go, that probably will come in around 50 to 60% of all the loans outstanding in Indonesia are non-performing. People aren't making payments on their loans. Now, also in the background of the story, before we get started, is the fact that you've got, of course, crony capitalism in Indonesia, as you have in many emerging market countries, not only in Southeast Asia, but and that's where the focus has been. But of course, Russia and the former Soviet Union. I suppose you've been covering those topics, as Frank alluded to earlier, and it's a little more embedded, and the scale is much larger in the former Soviet Union in terms of crony capitalism and corruption. The interesting part is that the economies in the former Soviet Union have continued to collapse, and of course the cronies take a bigger take there than they do in Southeast Asia, where the economies grow pretty rapidly. The other thing in the background of Indonesia, obviously, is that the Americans for some time have been concerned, shall we say, about the general state of the political system and so-called lack of democratic institutions in Indonesia, or at least our style of democratic institutions. And there also has been kind of a steady chorus about human rights abuses in Indonesia. So that's kind of the backdrop. The question is, how did we get from this fairly good economic picture into what's a complete disaster going into 1998? And it started really in Thailand in July. The Thai baht collapsed on the 7th of July. And this really did have a contagion effect that started going throughout Southeast Asia, as you know. The problem in Indonesia was that the Indonesian rupiah had been a fairly stable currency and more or less loosely linked to the US dollar for a number of years. And of course, the economy itself had been very stable. There were really very few imbalances in the internal economy or the external sector of the economy. So everything was kind of going along smoothly. And there was one little Achilles heel to the whole thing, and that was that the private sector of the economy in Indonesia was heavily indebted, and most of the debt was external debt denominated in foreign currency. So that's fine if you buy insurance for the possibility of the rupiah depreciating against the external debt that you have, dollar-denominated debt in large part. The Indonesian corporations had not done that. They'd not hedged their bets, so to speak, and so they were short dollars and long rupiah, and this is a risky proposition, especially when you sense a whiff of trouble in the region. And this Thai baht collapse, when that occurred in July, the Indonesian corporation said, well, we better start covering the short dollar positions and selling rupiah, buying dollar positions, because we've got all this external debt. Now, the external debt, by the way, is very large numbers. We don't know exactly how large it was or is. It's probably in the neighborhood of $80 billion to $100 billion. Now, this is not government debt. The government and their fiscal affairs have been quite prudent over the years. So this isn't the classic Mexican case where the Mexican government is going into debt and has piles of external debt, sovereign debt. This is private debt, private corporations. So once they started covering their external exposure and selling rupiah, buying dollars, of course, you know what starts happening. The pressure on the foreign exchange, on the rupiah, started occurring. And you could see this. The main symptom was that the foreign exchange reserves at the central bank started declining, sliding down, and the game was really started then in July, early August. And the pressure on the rupiah became greater and greater, and finally the central bank decided on August 14th that they would float the rupiah and let it find its own value in the market, not try to manage it with the central bank. Now, the IMF, of course, cheered this move, and unfortunately the rupiah didn't float, it quickly sank. And by October, the IMF was actually called in officially by the Indonesians to try to help stabilize the situation. Their first IMF agreement was put into place in late October. On November 1st, the first thing the IMF did was close 16 banks in Indonesia without virtually any planning whatsoever. There were 16 big banks. There's no deposit insurance in Indonesia. You can imagine the panic that set in. Everyone was trying to take their money out of the banks, which created really a financial panic. So we went from kind of a slow rot in the currency to this floating regime, which put more uncertainty into the situation and caused the currency to start going down fast with kind of no safety net under it at all. And then this bank closure on November 1st really put panic in the system. I mean, people were really trying to get their money out of the banking system and out of Indonesia, which put even more pressure, of course, on the rupiah, because the money was going from Jakarta to Singapore, with the biggest capital flight coming from the Chinese community in Indonesia. Then on January 15th, the second IMF agreement was signed, and the President Suharto signed this with Mr. Kem Dasu in presence of Kem Dasu, And this is the agreement you've read about in the papers. It's really IMF 2. It was a second agreement. And at this point in time, in January, the main thing you had was a financial panic going on and really a collapsing currency. So you had a currency crisis, kind of a financial crisis and panic, all wrapped up into one. And on the 15th of January, the IMF agreement number 2 was signed, and on that day, the rupiah lost about 10% of its value, and for the whole week, it lost about 40% of its value, and this was on top of very, very depressed levels that existed on January 15th. The reason for this was that this IMF agreement was mainly a microeconomic structural adjustment program that wasn't really even authored by the IMF. It was a World Bank program pulled off the shelf and injected into the Indonesian situation. Now, what was the point of a microeconomic structural adjustment program? The main point was to go after the crony capitalism. It was to break up the cartels and the clove monopoly, the plywood monopoly, and some of the things that you've read about in the paper. But it had nothing to do with a collapsing currency or a financial panic that literally had been started by the IMF back in November in the first place. It also was a program that before the ink was dried on the second IMF agreement, it collapsed. I mean, the markets deemed the thing to be irrelevant, having nothing whatsoever to do with the problems that they were facing in Indonesia, and they just took the currency right down. And that's when it went down from, we'd started this whole process, by the way, at around, let's say, 2,500 rupiah to the dollar. By the time we were into January 15th, we were down around 7,000 rupiah, something like that, and it just went into complete free fall down to 16,000 rupiah to the dollar. Now, with this rupiah going down, what we had is about 70 to 80% of the private sector at an exchange rate of 10,000 rupiah to the dollar is insolvent. That means they're bankrupt. And the reason for this is, with all this external debt that they have, you have to earn more and more rupiah to be able to service the external debt that you have that's all denominated in dollars, yen, Deutschmarks, and whatnot. So the private sector had become insolvent due to the collapsing currency. With a collapsing currency, you also get another thing going on, and that is inflation starts feeding into the economy if your currency collapses. So with a bankrupt private sector, unemployment going up, people with no income, and food prices, as well as other prices on the rise, you can see why the second IMF agreement was deemed to be a complete disaster by President Suharto, and that's when he got in touch with me the last week in January. Mrs. Hanke and I were quietly enjoying ourselves in Istanbul, and out of the blue got word that the president wanted to see me right away to talk about solution for Indonesia's currency problems. Now, when word got out, of course I went to Jakarta right away, and when word got out of our meeting and my appointment, things got very interesting. The first thing that happened is that the rupiah staged a huge rally of 28% in one day, contrary to, this is really the market test of the whole thing. If you cut it all away, every time the IMF, President Clinton, G7 finance ministers, you name it, would utter a word about what was going on in Indonesia, the currency would collapse. Every time Suharto would say something about currency reform of the type that I was proposing, the currency would rally and get strong. In any case, President Clinton, of course, did start calling President Suharto. In fact, he called him 4 times a fairly unusual kind of operation. So there was very heavy intervention directly from the White House. There was a lot of intervention from U.S. Treasury Secretary Rubin and his lieutenants. The IMF, obviously the stalking horse of the administration, was in the press quite a bit. Also, President Clinton sent former Vice President Mondale down to Jakarta to stop in and see President Suharto. Now, this didn't really have anything to do with currency, economics. It was right before the new cabinet was to be put in place, and the Clinton administration's wish list was presented to President Suharto. So there was a lot going on in this period. But by February 26th, I presented what I called the IMF Plus program, or I should say what President Suharto ultimately called the IMF Plus program, which he embraced officially in his State of the State message, I think 3 days, I think it was the 29th of February, if I'm not mistaken. Now, what's in this program, of course, has almost never been reported on. It contained the second IMF agreement, because we didn't want to get the IMF completely out of the picture. Among other things, the IMF supplies cheap credit, and that's nice to have. Plus, they can give you a lot of trouble and bad press if you don't have them on board. So we kept the old IMF program that, remember, had failed and didn't have anything to do whatever with the crisis that was upon us. The other thing that it had added to it, which was reported in the press, was a currency, a currency board system. And the currency board system would have set a fixed exchange rate for the rupiah and the dollar. It would have required the rupiah to be backed 100% with U.S. dollars. It would have required that the monetary authority, the currency board, could not issue credit and put credit into the system. It would have no discretionary policies whatsoever. It would literally put handcuffs on the Indonesians. And that's why these systems work and don't fail, because the central bankers and the politicians can't maneuver the exchange rate or monetary policy in any way. They're just locked in and really put in a straitjacket. So the rupiah would in effect have become as good as the U.S. dollar. The other add-on that we had in IMF Plus is a debt rescheduling for all this mountain of external debt that the Indonesian private sector had. That was vital and is vital because even at some new reasonable exchange rate, they still have a lot of foreign debt, and there's going to have to be some sort of rescheduling of it. The next add-on was a bank reform and recapitalization program. And lastly, there was a big privatization program, and I explained to the president that he wanted to know what this had to do with stabilizing the currency, because it was the currency, stupid. I mean, he had that the first 30 minutes when I met President Suharto. He diagnosed the situation exactly right. If you don't get the currency up to some realistic level and stabilize it, you're going to literally have blood in the streets ultimately, because you'll have all the private sector insolvent, lots of unemployment, people with no money, big increase in inflation that by the way, Indonesia's not Latin America. They are not used to high inflation rates in Indonesia. So you really had a potent cocktail, and one that had to be diluted and put in order. So this privatization program, back to the last kind of key component in the IMF Plus program that I proposed, was to put credibility into the markets. Most people, to put it mildly, are skeptical of President Suharto and his resolve to follow through on economic reform. So I said, you got to take the 5 biggest state-owned enterprises and just put them on the block and auction them off as fast as you can. So that was the IMF program, the IMF Plus, I should say, program. Now, the interesting thing here, I'll make just a couple comments about this, because even if we go back to the Baltimore Sun editorial of March 1st, of course, is banging away on my proposal in Indonesia. Now, the odd thing about it is that, I mean, after all, I am a hometown boy, and no one ever called me from the Sun asking me anything about what the proposal was. But of course, they can wax eloquent and write editorials about it. I mean, they know so much about it, so they say, okay, they're talking about Suharto. Suharto used a proposal by Johns Hopkins professor Steve H. Hanke tying the value of the rupee to the dollar as a substitute for structural reform. Well, as you see, the IMF Plus program that he embraced had all the IMF structural reform program in it, and then the currency reform, debt restructuring, banking reform, and the big privatization, which even the privatization is structural reform. So they were a little off base there. I might also mention that on the 23rd, they were also editorializing in the Sun. I'm not really picking on the Sun, but I mean, people read the Sun here, so you can see. It was typical of what was going on. Again, no call. Through this whole thing, I got not one call from a reporter from the Sun. They even had one reporter file a story from Jakarta who never called me or anything, and is hooked up to my email. He's somebody based in China who I correspond with from time to time. Even he didn't contact me. But their point in the February 23rd article is that they're going on about how bad currency boards are and what a disaster, and that you have to do all these other reforms first, supposedly, before you can have a currency board. And as they say, rarely if such a desperate group of economists agreed, that meaning the critics of this currency board kind of system. Well, there isn't quite the picture, because in March 22nd, the Far Eastern Economic Review, Milton Friedman weighed in on my side. One Nobel laureate. We also had on our side Gary Becker, another Nobel laureate, Merton Miller, another Nobel laureate. We had Sir Alan Walters writing in England supporting this idea, significant player because he was Margaret Thatcher's personal economic advisor, former Hopkins professor, by the way. And so the architect of the Thatcher Revolution, and more importantly, the architect of the currency board system that was put in Hong Kong in October of 1983 to stop the big crisis in Hong Kong when they had a huge capital outflight and financial panic going on. Okay, enough on the press at that point. Now, where do we end up? We have President Suharto embracing this IMF Plus program, which I've given you the elements of, and then we had even more pressure from President Clinton and the various camp followers of Clinton to do the IMF program. I mean, they kept telling Suharto, we don't want to talk about IMF Plus. You're doing IMF minus. You're not doing the IMF program of January 15 that you agreed to. Of course, this thing had nothing, as I said, to do with the crisis. There was no way Suharto was going to do this. So he hung tough and stayed pretty cool. And finally, at the end of the day, the Clinton administration and the IMF, who was really doing their bidding for them, came around to agree to set up 5 working groups to discuss the overall situation in Indonesia. And the 5 working groups were monetary policy, banking reform, rescheduling of debt, structural reforms, and the budget for 1998-1999. They ultimately came to another agreement after the working groups, accepting everything I'd proposed in IMF Plus except the currency board. So the monetary policy that they proposed and that they're using right now is a dirty floating exchange rate, one that's managed by the central bank in Indonesia. The big problem with this is that the central bank has no credibility. No one believes it. So the only way that you can stabilize an exchange rate if you don't have credibility is to have very high interest rates. Pay people high interest rates to keep their deposits in rupiah rather than being in dollars or something else. This, of course, is the Achilles heel of the current agreement, which, remember, it's the IMF plus my proposal minus the currency board, which would have been the linchpin for the IMF plus agreement. So what we've done is that in the last, well, almost month now since the IMF 3 agreement has been signed, interest rates have been doubled in Indonesia to stabilize the currency, and of course banks are dropping like flies, and you're seeing more and more street unrest, which you'll continue to see as the inflation, because of the devaluation, gets into the economy. The private sector remains more or less insolvent, and now they have these punishingly high interest rates. Interest rates have gone up to about 55%. I think they'll probably have to go up towards 100% to hold the currency stable. The whole thing will probably collapse because it doesn't have the linchpin of the currency board in it, and then we'll come back in with, of course, the currency board to clean the mess up, and that probably will occur within the next 2 or 3 months. With that, Frank, I think I'll open the floor for questions.
We thank you very much. Do you feel that the IMF Plus program of President Suharto dealt with the difficulties of the IMF's original proposal, IMF 1?
It didn't deal explicitly with them, but since the whole package was kind of had a vision. If you're going to have a major change in public policy, it has to have some vision to it and something that's clear to the general public. The general public, the thing that was clear was the currency board. Now maybe that's why it was reported every place. It was certainly the most controversial element of it. But so the public understands. They don't want their money melting away in their pockets, and particularly the lower income strata of the population is the one that's hit, because most of their assets that they have, it's cash. I mean, the people with money, all the money's in Singapore anyway, or Zurich, or someplace else. That's not a problem. So they don't get agitated if the money they have is sound. And you can see this. There's almost no rioting going on in parts of Indonesia that are dollarized. In other words, that are using the dollar. There are various pockets in Indonesia, for example, like Bali. There's no problem in Bali because the dollar is really the second currency, and it's easy for people to get it so they can protect themselves.
Sure. Would you comment on the street demonstrations?
Well, there'll just be more of them because the price increases are going to be larger, and there'll be more and more companies going bankrupt and more people being thrown out of work. So that situation will continue to get worse. It won't stabilize.
At this microphone.
As I understand it, to establish your currency board, you have to purchase dollars with rupiah. Are there sufficient rupiah in the system to purchase enough dollars? And when you have done that, do you have enough rupiah left? How do you operate your day-to-day economy?
The camera can pick up the questions from the floor.
Number one, when we started the first part of February, we actually had enough reserves in dollars to cover the outstanding rupiah money supply. So it wasn't, and initially it wasn't really an issue. We never could get a technical response from the IMF about what their objection was to the currency board. On February 11th, Monsieur Camdessus, the director of the IMF, sent President Suharto a letter, and it was about a page and a half long, and more or less one page was going on about how the IMF liked currency boards, and in fact, we'd put one in Bulgaria under the mandate from the IMF to put one in. That was in July of 1997. Also in August of 1997, one was installed in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and that one was mandated by the Dayton Agreement. And there have been Estonia, Lithuania, Argentina. There have been a lot of new ones since 1990. They've all worked well, and that was kind of the first part of the letter. And then Camdessus said, but this isn't the right time to put one in Indonesia. And that was and so don't put it in. That was essentially the letter. So we had various meetings with the envoy from the IMF talking about these things, and I said, well, what I want is a technical memorandum telling us technically why you don't want a currency board in Indonesia right now, because after all, at the same time we received this letter, we knew they were over in Cambodia trying to sell a currency board to the Cambodians. So we wanted a little technical backup. Well, we never got it, of course. They never gave us anything. And time kept running, and then all of a sudden they came up with the silver bullet. The silver bullet was, well, the foreign exchange reserves have run down to the point where the dollar assets wouldn't cover the total money supply in Indonesia. So, see, we were kind of right all the time. We did have a technical reason why you couldn't put in a currency board. So at the last minute, of course, this is a kind of nonsense, because what you can do is shut the printing presses off on the old rupiah, freeze the supply of old rupiah, let it continue to circulate as legal tender in Indonesia, and then use whatever reserves you have to set up a currency board that issues a new rupiah backed 100% by the dollar, and then you would let the old rupiah and the new rupiah float against each other in a floating exchange rate, and just have two parallel currencies operating. This works. It's worked many times in the past. Of course, that didn't satisfy anyone, needless to say, except me. But that's kind of the story on reserves. It wasn't really an issue. It ultimately became an issue. We came up with a solution to the problem, and it was just kind of ignored and dismissed, and that's a reserve story. There are, by the way, related reserve stories, because they're too unique. There are all kinds of criticisms of these currency boards. They're kind of standard run-of-the-mill things. Most of them have all been covered and dissected and whatnot in books that I've written on the topic. Most of them don't stand either the test of history or any empirical evidence, but there were two unique things in Indonesia, two unique critiques. One was related to reserves, and it was that, well, if you put a currency board in, all the cronies would take the rupiah to the currency board, exchange it for the dollars that you had at the currency board at the fixed exchange rate, drain all the dollars out of the economy, and of course then the money supply would collapse and you'd go into a huge depression. That's never happened in the past. What happens once you put the currency board in, confidence comes, and people increase their demand for rupiah, in this case, would have increased their demand for the domestic money, and that would have increased the dollar reserves, of course, in the system, because to get a new rupiah, you got to bring a dollar in and give them a dollar. Now, that would have also decreased interest rates and injected more liquidity into the economy, not less. This is what's happened. In Bulgaria, the interest rates were about 365% when we put the currency board in, and a month later they were 5.5%. And the reason why, you see, everyone was rushing out of dollars and Deutschmarks into Bulgarian lev to get those high interest rates. And the reason they made the big rush to the high interest rates, they weren't worried about the exchange rate risk anymore with the currency board, because the lev and the Deutschmark were fixed together, locked together in a fixed exchange rate that was credible. Now, the second little thing that was unique to the Indonesian critique kind of was that, well, you know, this foreign economist wanted to, I mean, he's just doing Suharto's bidding for him, and he wants to artificially move the exchange rate from, it was about 10,000 at the time we started this thing, up to 5,000. That was every place that was reported. Even the Wall Street Journal even had an article quoting me in some report that I'd never even written, that I was going to set the exchange rate at 5,500. And it took the Wall Street Journal about 2.5 weeks even to run a correction. It was just unbelievable. So the Sun isn't the only culprit, believe me. I mean, they're kind of small-time players in the scheme of things. What we would have done is let the market set the rate. And it would have worked just like we did in Bulgaria, which is the way I've recommended to always do these things. You announce that you're going to put in a currency board, and you don't fix the exchange rate at first. You just announce you're going to let the exchange rate float in a free market for a given period of time, and then at the end of that period of time, you see what the exchange rate is in the free market, use whatever art, judgment, and so forth you have, and decide then where you will actually fix it and lock it in. That's what we did in Bulgaria. That's what we would have done in Indonesia. I had never said anything about fixing the rate artificially. Anyway, you see, you got me off on the reserve question there, but I covered a few things I wanted to cover and didn't have time to in the talk.
Would you comment about the corruption in Indonesia?
Yeah.
Especially in your employer's family.
Yeah, well,
especially with the ruling regime.
Okay. First of all, I of course brought this up and talked to the president about it on numerous occasions. So he knows my general views on the issue. As far as what to do about it, this is literally has been the economic thrust of the IMF 1 program and IMF 2 program. Those were the programs to bust up the crony capitalism. The only remark that I can have there, all it did, it literally destabilized the economy enormously. So if your objective is to destabilize the economy, not deal with the urgent problem that you have at hand, doing the structural adjustment and only the structural adjustment, that's what you get. You get a lot of instability in quite a big, important place. The other remark that I would make that I alluded to earlier is it's interesting that this very narrowly focused IMF program on Indonesia, which really was an anti-cronyism program, the first two. It's interesting that was, I would say, selectively applied to Indonesia, not some of the other countries in the region, and certainly not one of some of the biggest benefactors of the IMF, Mexico and Russia. I didn't do an audit, by the way, of the books to see what the magnitude is. I mean, I've read about it, and it's big. It exists.
Yes, sir, at the microphone.
This may be kind of a dumb question after your long answer to the gentleman on the currency board, but I wondered if you could explain why President Suharto couldn't have unilaterally installed the currency board.
He could have installed one unilaterally, and by the way, another unique kind of critique, it gets into a little bit the question about the crony capitalism. Another critique was, well, Suharto's a slippery character, and you can't trust him and so forth, therefore you can't let him have a currency board. Well, this is the stupidest argument, because what he was saying is, I know what the problem is. The problem is a weak, unstable currency. If I don't get it stronger and stabilize it, I'm out of here. That was literally the bottom line on the thing, and I'm willing to pay any price to stabilize the currency, including the currency board, which would require me to put handcuffs on myself. The central bank, from November through the end of January, had increased credit into the banking system by an amount, a fantastic amount, equal to 12% of GDP. Now you can't do that with a currency board. You're not going to be bailing cronies that have banks out, or the government state-owned enterprises or family enterprises or anything else. So he could have unilaterally put this in. What would the price of, and he was fairly close to doing it. They kept making the soup a little richer for him, including a huge increase in humanitarian aid, because they were running out of rice, among other things. And so they're not only, the sticks were unbelievable, as you know, but there were quite a few carrots that got thrown in at the end, including everything in that IMF Plus program. Don't forget, he got absolutely everything that he wanted except the currency board, and people said, well, maybe they do know what they're doing at the IMF and they can stabilize the currency. So I don't think that was wise, but that was how it ended up. But so there were big sticks and fairly decent carrots by the end of the thing. And we discussed this, incidentally, and he told President Clinton too. He said, if you can come up with a better package than Hanke, he said, I'm taking it. And in his judgment, putting everything together, what the ultimate agreement looked like was better than IMF Plus.
The Southeastern Asian countries who are having problems are, of course, Thailand, Indonesia, and Japan. What about some of the others, like Vietnam or, I'll say Burma because I can't pronounce the new name. What is their financial situation, their economy?
Vietnam was kind of looking good there for a while, and I think the bloom is off the rose, and things are looking pretty bad there. The whole region looks bad, because what you have going on, we had the first big part of the crisis, which is all this currency upheaval and whatnot. Now the hard part comes, and that is all these big groups, whether it's in South Korea, Thailand, and whatnot, and the banking systems have to go through a huge shakeout and reorganization, which will be unbelievably disruptive and painful. So we'll get big aftershocks in Asia coming now for some time, in my view, and of course,
to our economy, you mean? The aftershocks will be to our economy.
The aftershocks will ultimately hit the U.S. economy, but looking at the region itself, it'll be quite volatile and a very disruptive next few years as they have the shakeout and reorganization of the economies. And a little bit, the wild card in the thing is Indonesia, because it is big, and if they can't stabilize the exchange rate with more modest interest rates, I think the thing will really explode, and that's what I'm anticipating. Although the third IMF agreement has a higher chance of success, obviously, than the second one, which I failed on signing almost, its chances are not too good because it's missing this whole currency apparatus at the center.
Well, Indonesia is one of the largest in population in the world, isn't it? Around 9th, I think. But is, it covers about 1,001 islands. Is it possible to have a commodity board in a country like that, whereas it's easy in a small country like Bosnia, Bulgaria, and Lithuania, the three of those that you mentioned?
Size, it doesn't have anything to do with it. And I think the best example on this is to look at how the world's monetary system operated from 1880 to 1914, when we were on a gold standard, because a currency board is nothing more than a gold standard operation, technically without gold. Instead of gold, you've got dollars backing the currency and fixed exchange rates. So virtually the whole world was on a currency board type system during the gold standard, and the thing we had very good performance. We also even around the turn of the century had currency boards in most of Africa, a lot of Latin America. I mean, big places. So the size issue is kind of irrelevant. They do have currency boards now in lots of small places. I mean, Argentina isn't that small, but it's still relatively small.
Do you believe that Suharto will be brought down by the economic crisis?
Well, he anticipated even the first week in February what's happening today, and it's not a very pretty picture. I think we can look at his concerns and kind of infer what's going to happen. It's going to get worse, not better.
Sir, could you discuss the implications of the problems in Indonesia and the Southeast Asian countries on the American economy?
Well, in a nutshell, the local economies there are depressed. They're on one hand. On the other hand, they have a lot of capacity to produce. They also have very cheap currencies now relative to the dollar, which means they're going to be exporting a lot more ultimately. They are also going to be importing a lot less, and this will hurt profit margins in the United States. And lower profit margins, I think, will be the thing ultimately that take the stock market down. So yes, there is a link there, and I don't agree with the consensus that earnings will grow 14% in the United States in 1998. I think they'll be closer to 6%, and if they are, you can't justify price-earnings ratios of 27, 28 times in the United States. And on top of that, by the way, the Fed will probably increase interest rates slightly in the coming months, which is another negative to pull that price-earnings ratio down and cause an adjustment in the stock market.
One follow-up question, if I may. Will the ability of the currency in Indonesia have an effect on the dollar?
No.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am, at the microphone.
I'd like to know, what can we Americans do here to protect ourselves from this coming crisis and perhaps help them and other people who are affected by it as well?
Well, I think the big thing in Asia is that, I mean, the United States is really trying to micromanage these economies that they don't know very much about. I mean, if you just think about it, even in simple-minded terms, the IMF has 182 countries that are members. Now, how much can they possibly know about each of these 182 countries? They don't know much about them. I mean, this is why this second IMF agreement looks so ridiculous. When you read it, it was incredible, a 50-point thing, and I'm just continue reading down the thing. I hit 50, and I say, well, where's the beef in this thing? I mean, it was just unbelievable. As I said, that second IMF agreement actually really wasn't even an IMF program. It was a World Bank program because they didn't know what else to do at the time.
So
Sir,
getting
in the
them to back off would help a lot.
I think let these countries fix their own problems, decide what kind of exchange rates they're going to have. Let Hashimoto in Japan decide how he's going to fix a mess in Japan, rather than having President Clinton tell him the ABCs of Japanese economics and whatnot. I mean, that's really the solution. The problem from, again, this foreign affairs point of view, we're going back to the great imperial power and using commercial power as we did in the late 19th century in Southeast Asia, as well as all parts of the world. I mean, the U.S. is trying to run the world in terms of the commercial sphere and economic sphere of its activities, and we're very overextended. And that's why, if you want to really find out what's going on in foreign policy, you have to see what Secretary Rubin at Treasury is saying. The Secretary of State has very little to do with any of this. And in fact, on Indonesia, there were conflicts between State and Treasury because Treasury took it all over. They were running the whole thing. With, of course, the IMF comes into it because the IMF is a stalking horse of the United States. It's controlled by the United States.
Do you expect another round of devaluations of currencies? And then secondly, what percentage of our exports actually do go to Southeast Asia?
I won't put it in the framework of devaluation. There's going to be a lot more currency kind of instability in the region and volatility. In terms of our exports going to the region, I can't remember the number right off the top of my head. The region's exports going to the rest of the world, I do remember that number. It's 25%. So the Southeast Asia is a big place. People can't get it. For example, all of Latin America, including Mexico, only accounts for 4% of world trade. Asia, excluding India, accounts for 25%. So you get problems in Asia. It's big, and it has ripple effects every place. There's no way you can get away from it.
Let me merely, on behalf of the audience, thank you very much for, I think, a wonderfully informative evening. And I think it's been a most interesting discussion, one that we could use more of. And I think it's expanding our view and reminding us of the centrality of international economics in our political affairs. Thanks for a wonderful evening. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I do have to congratulate you on getting this crowd together on short notice. I think you were a little concerned about that. I was even more concerned about it. And here we are with a full house. Thanks, Frank.
Thanks,